Rob here at eTrailer.com, and today you're going to be taking a look at the SumoSprings front helper springs on our 2019 Ford F-53 chassis motorhome. Now, having a motorhome can be really nice. We can take trips with our family, see places that we've never been before, but one thing a lot of people don't talk about is how our motorhome is going to handle. We get a lot of questions here at eTrailer.com about motorhomes, and typically it's about the suspension. Because motorhomes are going to be a lot more top heavy, which means when we're going through the road we'll get a lot of sway and kind of rolling feeling. Or if we're driving down the road and we have a big gust of wind, it'll push us to the side and then we end up fighting that steering wheel. Not to mention the bumps can be extremely jarring. Well, our helper springs are going to help take care of and alleviate a lot of those problems. So now that they're in place, let's take them on our test course and see how they improved everything. As I'm going through my course here, I can definitely feel a lot more stable as I'm driving. And as I come up to the slalom course here, and I start going in and out of the turns, it definitely feels a lot more rigid, and I don't have so much of a rolling feeling going on. It just turns when I tell it to turn, rather than before when it starts to turn, lean really bad, and kind of just feel unstable. But it feels a lot more in control and a lot easier to drive. And as I'm going over the speed bumps, it's definitely improved. It still has a bump to it, but it's not as jarring and it's not as hard, and it reacts a lot quicker. It's not continuing to bounce as I'm going down the road. And when I get to the alternating speed bumps, still have a little bit of a roll, but it's a lot more improved over the factory because, again, it's reacting a lot quicker, and I can actually go over the speed bumps and not have to worry about fighting the steering wheel to get it back centered. So here's what our springs are going to look like once we have them installed. Now, I do want to mention that we have our motorhome lifted up by the leveling jacks, and that's why we have this gap here. But that is a good way to show you that our springs are actually going to be a two-piece design, which in most cases, if it is one piece, it's going to limit us on how much upward travel we have or the rebound. Initially, when we go over a bump, we have the downward travel, but as we come back up, it needs to react. This is going to allow us to have unlimited suspension travel, but when we do have that extra weight, it's going to come down and compress the spring and provide us all the support we need. Our springs are going to mount between our frame and on top of our front axle. And that's where we're going to get all the stability from. It's going to prevent the frame from coming down too far or the axle coming up too far. And whenever it does start to compress and the weight comes down, our springs are going to have a progressive rate to them. Which means that when we have less weight or we don't hit a hard bump, it's going to have a soft engagement and it's going to be somewhat softer. But the heavier load we put or harder we turn and more pressure we put on it, the more compressed they're going to get and the harder they're going to get. But the nice thing is we're not going to have to worry about any nearby components because when they start to compress, they're going to have very minimal side expansion. So we're not going to have to worry about shocks, our brakes, or anything else nearby interfering with our springs. Our spring is going to replace our factory joust stop. Now if I hold my factory joust stop up to the frame, we can see just how much bigger the spring itself is than the factory one. And that's because the factory joust stop is really just there to prevent bottoming out. It's not going to provide us any support or give us any cushion. But our new springs, since they're going to be in contact once we lower it down, they're always going to have the support we need, and the material is going to absorb a lot of the road shock. The blue part of the spring here is made out of a high-density microcellular urethane, so we're not going to have to worry about any kind of maintenance on them. Once we have them installed, we can forget about them. But they're also going to be resistant to most automotive chemicals, UV rays, and even road salt, so we know that they're going to last a long time. Now we're going to have these springs, one on each side of our axle. That way, not only taking out the bumps and shocks and helping us support the weight of our motorhome, but it's also going to help reduce the amount of body roll and sway that we feel. Because as soon as we turn, the springs are going to start to compress on one side and elongate on the other, help keeping it level and making sure that we don't have that mushy feeling when we're driving down the road. Our springs were rated at 2,600 pounds, but keep in mind that's not meant to increase the weight of your motorhome. It's just there to help support the weight and make sure we have a comfortable ride. So whether we're down in the desert where it gets really hot, our springs are going to work all the way up to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, or if we decide to take a trip through the mountains where it gets pretty cold, we know that our springs are going to work all the way down to -25 degrees. Our springs are going to come with everything you need to get it installed, both the upper and lower spring, all the brackets and hardware. And one of the best parts about it is that we're not going to have to drill or modify our motorhome in any way. But now that we've seen what they look like and gone over some of the features, let's put one side on together. To begin your installation, you want to park your motorhome on a nice flat level ground, and then we're going to use leveling jacks to raise up the front end, but we only need to do it enough. We don't need to lift the tires off the ground. We just want a little bit of stretch in the suspension. And when we come underneath, we'll see that we have our front axle here, and directly above that on the bottom of the frame, we're going to have our factory joust stop. Now we're going to remove this. There's a hole in the very bottom, so we can grab a short extension and a 13mm socket. We'll come up from the bottom, and it's not a bad idea to break this loose, but it's not going to fully come off because there's a nut on top of the frame that we're going to have to hold. So we can grab a 15mm wrench. We'll hold the nut on top of the frame while we loosen the bolt. And once we have it removed, want to make sure that you hold on to the nut. We'll pull the joust stop down, and we need to knock the bolt out of the joust stop. And you want to make sure you hold on to the hardware. You want to grab the upper bracket. This may be attached to the upper section of your spring. If it is, just take those bolts out. But you'll notice there's going to be two holes on either side and then a hole in the center. Before we put everything up, we want to grab 2 of the 3/8 flange bolts out of our kit, and we're going to drop them down through the 2 holes on either side. And we can take our factory bolt, and coming from the bottom, we're going to go up through the bracket, and this is going to attach directly onto the frame. So for now, we'll get everything loosely attached. We'll push the bracket up through the frame, holding that bolt, and we'll secure it using the factory nut. Now on the bracket, you'll notice on the ends here, there's a small notch, and that's meant to grab onto the frame. So when we tighten it up, you want to make sure those ears grab onto the frame, they're sitting nice and square. We'll grab our 13mm socket and 15mm wrench, and we'll tighten up that bracket. Now where the 2 bolts are coming down through our bracket, we're going to grab our upper section. You'll notice it's got 4 threaded holes in it. 2 of these are going to line up with those bolts. So we'll lift our bracket up, see which ones line up, and then for now I'm just going to get these started by hand. Just get a couple turns on them to make sure they're not cross-threading. They're actually tightening up just enough to where that upper section of that spring will hang on the bolts, just like that. Then we can grab a 9/16 wrench, and if you have a ratcheting wrench, it will make it a little bit quicker. But we're going to tighten up each one of these bolts. Now I will let you know, you kind of want to alternate going back and forth so it draws up the spring evenly, because you don't want to trap the wrench in between the frame and the bolt here. And then once we get them all the way tight, just want to double check that they're nice and secure, and that upper spring isn't going to move around attached to the bracket. We're going to grab our lower bracket and section now. Now there's going to be 2 holes on the bracket on either side. We want those to be straddling our leaf spring pack here. So we're just going to slide our bracket in for now. And depending on how high you lifted your motorhome, it may be a little bit of a tight fit, but we should have room to get it in there. And we're going to position it so it's underneath that upper bracket. And again, these tabs are straddling the outside of the leaf springs going left and right. Now, to attach our lower bracket to the motorhome, we're going to have these kind of J-shaped with a little tab here. That hook here is going to fit right underneath that hole in the side of the bracket. So we'll just lift it up. It's going to sit just like that. So coming from the top of the bracket, we'll grab one of the flange bolts and we'll drop that down, making sure it's going through both brackets. We'll follow it up with a flat washer. And then finally we'll secure it down with a flange nut. Now for now, you can just leave this real loose, just enough so that all the pieces will hold itself together. And we're going to put another bracket on the other side in the same fashion with the same hardware. I'm going to come back with a 9/16 wrench and socket, and I'm going to tighten up my hardware. Now, when you first tighten it up, you kind of want to go slow just to bring that bolt up and draw the nut in. But you want to watch that bracket. Once it gets close enough, you want to make sure that it is hooked around and it's in the right position. And we're going to alternate going back and forth between the two sides so we can draw the bracket up evenly. And once you have everything tight and your springs are lined up, we're going to repeat that same process on the other side. But that'll finish up your look at the SumoSprings front helper springs on our 2019 Ford F-53 chassis motorhome.